We are traveling along in the exciting book of Genesis in our third series, as you well know. Third series being the age of the patriarchs. Near the end of chapter 37, look at what happened to Joseph. When the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. And then once he got to Egypt, he was sold again. The Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. There's so much more here than meets the eye. In the coming weeks, we're going to see just how momentous this is, or was. The sale of this teenaged boy was the very event that led to a period of over 400 years for the descendants of Joseph, the Israelites, to be in Egypt. In Egypt, they prospered for a while. In Egypt, they were enslaved for a long time. And then from Egypt, they were delivered and eventually returned to Canaan, the promised land. But just to think that it all started by these brothers pulling Joseph up out of the dry cistern and then selling him to the slave traders for 20 shekels. It makes me think of little sayings like this: small things can lead to great and long-lasting consequences, right? Small things. This small little event, I mean, as terrible as it was, lifting him up, selling him to the slave traders, off he goes to Egypt. It led to his whole family being in Egypt for 400 years. Or Coach Wooden, John Wooden, little things make big things happen. That's nice to reflect on that. Little things make great things happen. Or this one, I hope you all think of this in terms of your connection with Home Church Langley. Enjoy the little things in life, because one day you'll look back and you'll realize they were big things. I think we're going to look back on these days in that way. And one more, if you can't do great things, then do small things in a great way. I love that one too. You know, whatever you do it with all of your heart and do it in a big way. Do little things in big ways. But we're going to put ourselves in Joseph's shoes this morning. Here's a young man, just 17 years old. He gets up on Tuesday, looks at himself in the mirror, and he sees the appointed heir of a loving and devoted father. In obedience to that father, he goes out on a mission on that Tuesday morning in order to obtain news about his brother's well-being, in order to put his father's mind at ease, just to see where they are. Takes him 3 days, so I guess that brings us to Friday. He finds them, and they attack him. They just attack him, and they throw him into this dry cistern with a plan. The plan was to let him rot and die in that cistern. But later on, the same day, they change their minds and they decide instead to sell him on Craigslist. No, sell him to the slave traders. Tuesday, he's the heir. By Friday, he's in chains and he's on his way to Egypt. Maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days later, he's standing on the auction block in Egypt, and the guy's going, 20 shekels, yeah, would have been 25 shekels, 20, yeah, would have been 30 shekels, they would have been 30 shekels, 30 shekels, 35, 40 shekels, 40 shekels, going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And then later on the same day, the heir of Jacob is there chopping wood and hauling water and detailing bricks in a foreign land where he didn't even know the language. And yet, God was with him. More importantly still, at least as far as Joseph's psychological well-being was concerned, God was with Joseph, and Joseph knew it. He knew it. He knew that God was with him. And that's the key. That's the victory for all of us. To know that God is with us. To have the knowledge, to have the belief, to have the trust that God was with him right there in Egypt, right there in a foreign land, right there in this terrible, powerless situation. That was the reason behind Joseph's strength and the reason behind Joseph's success. Just before we dive more deeply into this passage, I just want to say, don't you know that God is with you, you believers? Don't you know that he's with you in the storm, that he's with you in the drought, that he's with you in the loss, he's with you in the danger, he's with you in the struggle, he's with you in the situation that's gone sideways, he's with you in the sickness. And even more, let me point this out. Don't you know that even when that situation took place years ago, God was with you then as well? One of the great hymn writers of yesteryear wrote, "Peace, perfect peace, with sorrows surging round." Note the question mark. Really? Peace, perfect peace, with sorrows surging round? On Jesus' bosom, naught but calm is found. Perfect peace, peace, perfect peace, with loved ones far away? Really? With loved ones far away, there can be peace, perfect peace? Yes. In Jesus' keeping, we are safe, and they. Peace, perfect peace, our futures all unknown? Really? Yeah. Jesus we know, and he is on the throne. Peace, perfect peace, death shadowing us and ours? Really? We can have peace with death stalking us, shadowing us, and our loved ones? Yes. Jesus has vanquished death and all of its powers. These four underlined phrases describe perfectly Joseph's situation. He's now in Egypt and he's carrying many sorrows. His loved ones so far away, his future entirely unknown, death for slaves, a very real possibility. And yet he knew that God was with him, and the presence of God overshadowed his life in Egypt at every stage. In his heart and in his mind, this is where Joseph landed. And this is where you and I must land as well, to know that God is with us for our own mental health, for our own well-being, for our ability to be used by God. We must land at this place in the presence of God, knowing the presence of God. The Bible makes this beautiful statement. Better is one day in your courts. Let's read it together, shall we? All together. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. If you had to make the choice, would you rather be Joseph, the victim of human trafficking? Joseph, the young man so unjustly treated? Joseph, the slave now in Potiphar's household? Would you rather be Joseph knowing that God was with you, or would you rather be one of the brothers holding this blood-stained coat, practicing their lies and their deception with their father every single day for the next 22 years? Which one would you choose? Would you rather be Joseph, knowing that God is with you, or would you rather be one of the brothers? So many times, we grumble and we complain about our terrible situation, the difficult thing that happened to us, the way that we were unjustly treated. But isn't it true that you can put up with anything, You can endure anything. You can persevere through anything because your God is with you. Is that not true? It is. Job proved it. Corrie ten Boom proved it. The Apostle Paul proved it. Kobe Wardenberg proved it. Joni Eareckson Tada proved it, and many of you have already proven it is true. So I would rather be a doorkeeper. I would rather be in a difficult situation. I would rather be obscure. I would rather be forgotten by the world so long as my God is with me. That is better by far than having a ticker tape parade and a bed of roses far away from my God. But there he is in Egypt. 22 years from now, his whole family is going to be in Egypt. The rest of the book of Genesis is in Egypt. And there's a lot to come. There's 14 chapters take place in Egypt. The next 430 some years is going to take place in Egypt in terms of Israel's history. Israel's early history is going to all develop and unfold in Egypt. So what do we know about Egypt? There's 4 little points I want to make today about this place to which Joseph arrived. Joseph arrived in ancient Egypt. After the great flood, Noah and his 3 sons and their wives stepped out of the ark in order to repopulate the world. We even know the names of the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We know a lot. We also know the names of the sons of Ham. His sons were Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Do you mean to tell me that one of Noah's grandsons was named Egypt? Yep, you're correct. The Bible tells us even more than that. It tells us about Egypt's descendants, that he was the father of the Ludites, the Anamites, the Leabites, the Naphtuhites, the Pathrusites, the Casluhites, from which the Philistines come, and the Caphtorites. I looked up a couple of these, and nobody knows who these people were. They're ancient. We know that Egypt is one of the most ancient. I didn't look them all up, so feel free to look all the rest of them up. I only did 1 or 2. We know that ancient Egypt is Egypt is one of the most ancient civilizations in the world. My first point is it was ancient already when Joseph got there. It was already ancient. Scholars differ somewhat on the age of the founding of Egypt, but scholars don't differ by all that much. It's not that big of a difference. Conservative interpreters, and that's my way of thinking, conservative interpreters of history agree that Egypt had been in existence for about 1,000 years when Joseph arrived. It was already 1,000 years old. 1,000 years is a lot of time for civilization to develop. How old's Canada again? 150? We're talking 1,000 years already. Between the time of Egypt's founding, which was around 3000 AD, give or take, until the invasion of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. From that beginning until everything changed in Egypt when Alexander the Great conquered it in 332, in that period of time there were 31 dynasties, Egyptian dynasties. Joseph arrived during the 15th dynasty. Moses led the people of Egypt out during the 19th dynasty, during the rule, in all likelihood, of a pharaoh by the name of Ramses II. He was the pharaoh of the Exodus. But my simple first point is that Egypt was an ancient land already when Joseph arrived. Not only was it an ancient land, it was an extremely wealthy land. It was probably the wealthiest nation on the earth, Egypt. And it owed a great deal of its wealth to that little teeny-weeny little stream that trickles through the middle of Egypt called the Nile. It's not a little stream. It's a huge, long river. One of the nicknames that Egypt has is it's called the gift of the Nile. Egypt exists because of that river, the Nile. From the Nile, Egypt receives water. It receives transportation. It receives trade. It receives fish. And it receives rich black soil and much more. Without the Nile River, Egypt would just be a desert. The whole thing would be a desert. But every year, the banks of the Nile overflow, every year. And it deposits silt in the region, which becomes this black soil. Now, have a look at Egypt from space. Can you see where the Nile River is? It's just lush and fantastic soil for superb agriculture, and Egypt plants and harvests 3 crops a year. Tell that to the combine pilots in Saskatchewan and Alberta, how much they would love that. 3 crops it harvests each year. And not only they had the Nile, but ancient Egyptians immediately adopted irrigation. They figured out irrigation right away, which led to abundant agricultural production, wheat, corn, barley, figs, melon, vegetables, olives, pomegranates. Egypt was perfectly self-sufficient with plenty of food. And then plus, Egypt had the high-quality clay all along the banks of the Nile. The Nile River, only 22% of the Nile's in Egypt. It goes down still thousands of kilometers. But it had all this high-quality clay, an inexhaustible supply for construction purposes. Plus, it had sandstone ready to be cut from the cliffs, which were on both sides of the Nile. And those blocks that were cut from the sandstone from the cliffs could easily be transported on and through the Nile River. Plus, it had gold mines and lots of precious stones. So, Joseph arrives in an ancient land. He arrives in a wealthy land. And thirdly, Joseph arrives in a magnificent land. Egypt was a magnificent place. And one of the reasons it was such a magnificent place is it had no natural enemies. Egypt had no natural enemies. It was protected by the Mediterranean Sea on the north. It was protected by the Red Sea on the east. And it was protected by vast deserts on the west and to the south. So during its first 1,000 years, and actually for many more years after that, it had no need for a big, expensive army. It had no need for big, expensive war campaigns. Instead, all the wealth of Egypt was plowed directly into construction and architecture. The 7 ancient wonders of the world, 6 of them are gone, but there's one that remains. The great pyramids of Giza, which are actually, I had a look on the map, I had no idea where they were. They're just on the outskirts of Cairo. So if you ever get a chance to go to Cairo, it's not far. It was, this great pyramid was built surprisingly early in the history of Egypt. How many dynasties were in Egypt? 31. This pyramid was built in the 4th dynasty already. Way before Joseph arrived. Joseph arrived in the 15th dynasty. This thing was built in the 4th. The builder of this great pyramid was a man named King Khufu, or if you prefer the Greek transliteration, King Cheops. Maybe you know this pyramid by that word, Cheops. We can only begin to imagine this king's grandiosity and his magnificence. We're talking about magnificence here, right? Imagine this man's ego. Imagine this man's drive, his ability to marshal the people of Egypt, he goes out a little west of the city. He stakes out the ground 755 feet on all four sides. 755 feet is more than 2 football fields. That's just one side. Stakes this whole thing out. It covers 13 acres of land. King Khufu was an architect, he was a mathematician, and he figured out how much stone would be required to build this one pyramid with hidden passageways and secret burial places, and apparently, at the beginning, a swivel door that you could just touch and it would swing open. And he built it to the height of 481 feet, which is 48 stories high. 48 stories high. And when he put his pencil down, he realized that he would need 2.5 million blocks of stone, each one of these stones weighing 2.5 tons. He staked it out. It was built by hired workers, apparently not slaves, hired workers. And he even built a city nearby to accommodate all these workers. He supervised the construction, and this guy lived to see it completed. 20 years. 20 years. And this pyramid remained the tallest building on earth until the 19th century. It's incredible. The magnificence of this land. It was magnificent in architecture. It excelled in mathematics. It excelled in agriculture. It excelled in shipbuilding. It excelled in medicine and many other areas. That is where Joseph arrived. Can you imagine? His eyes must have bugged out of his head when he arrived in Egypt. But there's a fourth area of Egypt that has to also be noted. That he arrived in a pagan and polytheistic land. Now, polytheism means many gods. Of all the nations of that day, Egypt was the most polytheistic of all. It had more gods than people could even remember, let alone call upon. It was kind of like Hinduism today, maybe not quite as many as Hinduism, but pretty close. Hinduism has how many gods? Patrick, I'm counting on you. I have no idea. Way too many. They have way too many. Anything more than one is too many. They have 33 million gods. And Egypt wasn't too far behind. The question is, was Egypt always polytheistic? Was it always polytheistic? Well, let's go all the way back. Was Noah polytheistic? Nope. He was monotheistic, one God. Do you think Noah's sons were polytheistic? Nope. They believed in one God. Noah's grandson, Egypt, certainly he was not polytheistic. Certainly he was monotheistic. Egypt became polytheistic. And here we just have to make a little comment about evolution. The theory of evolution has big Gordie Howe elbows, and it elbows its way into every field of study imaginable, including the origins of religion. The theory of evolution makes the claim that religion began polytheistically, with people seeing many gods behind every tree and every raindrop and every star and every sun. And then evolution claims eventually polytheism melted away and it was replaced by monotheism. And evolution further says that soon monotheism will be gone and we will arrive in the perfect land of atheism. So you go from polytheism to monotheism and then ultimately to atheism. Evolution says that's where we're headed. There are many problems with that theory. The first one being it doesn't fit with the Bible's teaching. The second one being it doesn't fit with the facts either, because anthropologists are discovering today that polytheistic tribes were once monotheistic. Now that fits the Bible's teaching. And what I want to just read to you is from Romans 1. As the Apostle Paul examined the religions of his day. This is what he wrote, that although they knew God, that's monotheism, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. That's much more of an accurate description of what happened in ancient Egypt. Once monotheistic, they came to worship, eventually over time, multiple gods, thousands of gods, gods having to do with the Nile and the land and the sky. And it's of interest to note that when Moses and Aaron announced the 10 plagues on Egypt, and I didn't know this, each plague had to do with the defeat of a major Egyptian god. Each of the 10 plagues had to do with the defeat of a major Egyptian god, demonstrating the greatness and the power of Israel's God. So that's probably the most of a history lesson that I've ever given on a Sunday morning. But it's important because there's 17-year-old Joseph, wide-eyed in this ancient land of splendid wealth, this ancient, magnificent land, this land of gods around every corner that he looked. And he never bought in. He didn't buy in to any of it, which is incredible when you think about it. He's plucked out from his family, he's plucked out from his people, and he's thrust into this environment, and he stays true to his God and stays true to what he believed. Now, how in the world did that happen? There's really two main reasons why. The first reason is that Joseph had character, and secondly, Joseph had awareness of the presence of God. These were the two things that sustained him as he went into this magnificent, influential land that should have really swept this 17-year-old boy off his feet and transformed him into one of them. It didn't. And the two things that he had going for him, his character and his awareness of the presence of God, are the very same things that you and I need here and now. And these are the very same things we need to pray for our children to have and our grandchildren to have in the 21st century, in this postmodern Canadian culture with its thoroughgoing secularism, with its political correctness, and with its intense, highly orchestrated pressure to conform on any number of social issues. We have to be like Joseph. Don't buy in. Don't let yourself go. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold, the Bible says. Remember that although Joseph was stripped of his fine, beautiful coat, he was not stripped of his fine, beautiful character. May the same be true of us. Take our coat away. Take our charitable donations away. New report just came out from the Senate. It's going to be gone pretty soon. Pretty soon. Recommendation 32 from the Senate. Joseph still had his character. It was not taken away. Like Joseph, we're all going to go through ups and downs in life because the Lord gives and the Lord takes away for reasons only He knows. But we, as His children, say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." But if we have the character of Christ, we shall remain elegantly stable and elegantly strong, for at the end of the day, it's the character of Christ that sustains us. And the character of Christ is all really that matters in terms of who we are. Who we are in Christ is always what remains. Joseph was God's man in a godless land, Not because anybody back home was going to notice. There was nobody looking. He was God's man in godless Egypt because he was God's man on the inside. He was godly within. He had character on the inside, and he lived it out on the outside. He stood for God internally, and he lived it out externally. And then, of course, the second reason that Joseph was able to stand tall in Egypt was because he had an awareness of God's presence. As you read, you can see our text this morning is Genesis 37 all the way to 50. Well, we're obviously not going to read all of that, but I'm going to point out a few verses. Because every time Joseph speaks in this whole narrative, 37 to 50, every time he speaks, he always refers to God. In his mind, God is always there, no matter what's happening. When Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, what does he say? He says, how could I do such a wicked thing against God? When he's thrown into prison and the chief cupbearer and the chief baker have their dreams, Joseph immediately replies, well, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. When Joseph appeared before Pharaoh and Pharaoh asked him for an interpretation of his dream, Joseph responds, well, I can't do that. But God will give Pharaoh the answer that he desires. When he interpreted the dream of Pharaoh, he began by saying, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. When those years had all gone by and he sees his brothers again after all those years, he eventually reveals himself to his brothers and he explains all the events of the past by saying, God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, it was God. In referring to his own children, I love this. He says, these are the sons that God has given to me. That's a good way of talking about your kids. These are the sons, the daughters God has given to me. At the very end, Joseph says to his brothers, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good and to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. His final words to his brothers were this, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and will take you up out of this land to the land that he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to our father Jacob, that you must carry my bones up from this place. Every time Joseph speaks, it's about God, God, God this, God that. He's always aware of God's presence. He's always aware that God is at work in the circumstances around him. He's always aware that God has a plan and God has a purpose. He doesn't always understand it. But this is what made him God's man in godless Egypt. He lived in the presence of his God. Oh, may God give us the same awareness as we drive our trucks, as we live our lives, as we go to work, in the school, in the factory. May God give us the same awareness as we live in a land that is changing and a land that is not changing for the better. As we live as strangers, increasingly we feel like strangers and aliens in this land, but we are here for Jesus' sake, and may the Lord bless us all for Jesus' sake. To him be the glory, now and forevermore. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord God, our Father, for this story of Joseph that we're just embarking on. Lord, thank you for the strong character that he had. And Lord, character is always in such short supply these days. Lord, I pray that our character would be strengthened by the character of Christ. Lord, that our weak human characters would be transformed by the strong character of Christ. Lord, that we would look at ourselves in the mirror and not see our frail human characteristics and the frail things that were inherited from our father and from our mother. But Lord, I pray that as we look in the mirror, we would see Christ in us, his character, the hope of glory. And Lord, I pray also that you would allow us to be increasingly aware of your presence in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.